Welcome to Cornell Keynotes. Today we are covering what our guest Erica Groshen is calling a crisis that is facing the official statistical and informational systems here in the United States. We'll learn what this crisis means for policy, legislation, business, and of course the broader economy. Joining us from Seattle today is Senior Economics Advisor from the Cornell ILR School and former Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Erica Groshen. Erica, lovely to have you on the show today. Thank you for joining.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, you bet. Viewers, thank you for joining us as well. Yes, Erica and I have prepared some questions and discussions and prompts, but we are actually interested in your questions and feedback as well. So drop your questions in the chat. We'll take them as they come in, if they fit the bill, presumably. And also, I actually am especially interested in your feedback, right? I want to know how we're doing through this production, how we generally do through keynotes if you've seen more than one. So near the end of our discussion today, we'll flash the QR code, give you a link to give us some feedback on not only how we're doing, but topics that you'd like to see us cover, etc. So thanks for your involvement as well, audience. Please note that this is live. It's being recorded, so if you want to share this afterward, the recording will be available moments after we're through. All right, Erica, let's get into it. So I'm curious about a couple things. Your economic advisory work that you do here at Cornell at the ILR School, and how your current work is informed by your experience as former commissioner of the BLS and also your work at the Federal Reserve.
Right. Well, at Cornell, I have the privilege, really, and the fun of serving as a resource to faculty and to students about data, particularly labor market data and inflation data, statistical products, economic conditions, and also policy. And that's very much informed by the long career I had at the Cleveland and New York Fed, and then my 4 years as BLS commissioner. And let me say that being commissioner at the BLS is like the best job ever, right? You're pursuing a really important and a pure mission in a highly respected agency. I learned something new every day about data, data users, data markets, inflation, statistics, the economy, how Washington operates. It was drinking from the fire hose for 4 straight years, which was great. And I was accompanied during this time by the world's most dedicated data nerds, and that's just great company to be in. So I had a great time doing it, and being able to bring that knowledge that I accumulated to my colleagues at Cornell has just been great fun.
So for those of us or among our audience who are unfamiliar with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we're going to be calling it the BLS, presumably throughout our conversation, what is the function? It's a government agency, part of the Department of Labor. How does it actually serve our nation? Why are, in this case, labor and inflation statistics important? Who are they important to?
Well, that's a great question. Let me start off by reading the official mission of the BLS, right? It's to measure labor market activity, working conditions, price changes, and productivity in the U.S. economy to support public and private decision-making. So those of us who love data sometimes forget why it is we fell in love with data. And that's, for most of us, it's really because we think it helps us make better decisions, that we can live our life better and we can help our community and our country when we have good evidence to base our decisions on. And really, our democracy and our whole economic system is founded on the premise that to get the best outcomes, we need to delegate most decisions down as far as possible, down to households, down to businesses and local communities. And that's when they decide what's best for themselves, it adds up to a vibrant economy. And that's true if the decisions are based on good data, on good evidence. If not, if some data are missing or the data is no good, then instead we get lousy decisions that inhibit our growth and our prosperity. So you asked me, for some examples. Monetary policy. My years at the Fed taught me well. The Fed's dual mandate is stable prices and maximizing sustainable employment. those are measured by the BLS. Right? It allows BLS data informs their decision and allows them to be accountable for their activities. Right? BLS produces, focusing on inflation, it produces what the data that are used to index contracts, which allows people to make contracts for longer than 1 year. Right? So we're talking about multi-year contracts for airplanes, for construction, for union wages, things like that. Without that reliable data from a very expert, impartial source, then you wouldn't get long-term contracts, and we'd be wasting a lot of time renegotiating constantly. Unemployment insurance extensions are based on BLS data, BLS unemployment rates, and that allows targeting of the areas that are most affected by during economic downturns. Financial markets respond very directly to BLS data that helps them to direct investments where they're needed most. Inflation, labor market data, et cetera.
Effectively a roll call of all the what are the most pressing and urgent issues that we're facing as a country right now. I want to ask you, in a Wall Street Journal opinion piece from 3 days ago, you and co-author and successor at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, William Beach, wrote that, quote, perhaps the most vital indicator the agency uses to understand our nation's economy, the U.S. monthly unemployment rate, is in imminent danger because it is outdated and underfunded. What are you getting out there? What is the crisis? Describe the contours of what it looks like.
Well, the basic thing to understand is that these days, most federal statistical products are very highly dependent on surveys, going out and asking households and businesses about conditions that they're facing. Yet response rates for these surveys have been falling. And you can see here, these are all BLS surveys. On the left, this is a graph of BLS surveys. On the left, you have a bunch of household surveys. And on the right, you have a bunch of establishment surveys and the response rates going back for the past 10 years. And what you can see is that they are all trending downward. And it's not just the past 10 years, it's been about 30 years of decline, right? And this makes surveys more expensive. We have costly follow-up. More people don't respond. You go after them and say, please, please respond, right? And it makes them less reliable because you've got larger standard errors and a higher likelihood that you've got unknown biases that have crept into the data that you're producing. All of the attempts to reverse this have maybe helped to stave off some of the decline, but they obviously haven't reversed it. So that's the crisis that the statistical agencies are facing.
So let me ask you this. It's funny, it almost feels counterintuitive that, 15, 30 years ago, we got better quality data and higher response rates when you would call someone on a telephone and they would actually pick it up, right? So it's strange that we're awash in data, yet the quality and the response rates are lower, probably because of those systems. So what forces are actually at work or not at work here? Are there external or environmental forces that are creating this conundrum and this crisis that we're facing?
Yeah, there's actually been a lot of academic research on this because it's so important, right? And the reasons, it's not one single reason, but there are a number of things at work here. First of all, there's survey fatigue. Surveys have proved so powerful and so informative and so useful that everybody wants to run surveys now, right? There are lots of surveys, and you get survey fatigue. Too many surveys asking people for their time for things that may not be important. You also have political and business type surveys that are masquerading as surveys, but they're really sales jobs or have some sort or another, right? So you've got survey fatigue. People are harder to reach because now we all have information about who's calling us, right? So people only answer the phone for people that they know, right? Screening devices. And there are more concerns about privacy than ever before. And unfortunately, what compounds this, what really makes it worse for the statistical agencies, that the funding has not solve this at all. In fact, we've had real declines in funding during this time. So, what you can see is here's funding for the BLS, for the National Agricultural Statistical Service and the National Center for Health Statistics, and these three graphs all show the same thing, that while nominal, there's been some increase in nominal funding for the past 15 years, in real terms, these agencies are suffering very large decreases in their funding. So BLS, 18% real decrease in their funding during this time. Our elected leaders really haven't prioritized adequate funding for the statistical agencies. So as people's, the wages and the BLS has gone up, there's been no commensurate increase in funding. Our congressmen, our senators, they don't run on platforms that say, you know, vote for me and I'll make sure the BLS is properly funded. Right? That's just not happening. Nor, you know, a general idea that, you know, that I'm running to enforce good government, right? And big corporate data users, financial, tech, industrial companies, et cetera, do a lot of lobbying, but not to support the BLS and the statistical agencies in producing the data that they need to operate properly.
Hey, can I ask you, on behalf of our audience, maybe most of us don't understand the difference to explain the wide chasm between nominal and real spending. Can you kind of you know, set us straight on that, what it really means practically and operationally?
Sure. So the nominal, you know, increase in the nominal budget is, you know, in current dollars, in the dollars that you're budgeting, you know, what's happened to the dollars allocated to BLS, for example, right? The real budget, you know, the real effect is, well, you have to take inflation out of that to know whether or not the agency is better off. All right. And so the real budget is when you make a comparison between 2 years, you can compare them on nominal levels. Did the budget go up by 5%? But in the real terms would be, well, how did it go up relative to inflation? Because if it didn't go up more than inflation, then in real terms, your budget has declined. And it's true for household budgets, and it's certainly true for an agency like the BLS, where most of the expenses are salaries for the workers.
Got it. I want to thank Timothy for the question, in that Timothy was thinking along the same lines as me when you were discussing the root causes of disengagement. And I do want to take this opportunity to reiterate to our audience that we will take your questions. Shoot them over to me. I've got them here in my Zoom ready to go. So thanks, Timothy, for that question. I think you and I were connected on wanting to know the answer to that one. Let me flip it a little bit. I want to ask about, okay, what does this really mean? What are the ripple effects that follow this data infrastructure decline? We've learned about some of the causes. What then happens? I'm thinking about the American workforce, the economy that you had just described. What are the ripple effects to this decline in crisis?
So let's think back to some of the users that I mentioned before and just see what happens to them when the data that they are using is lower quality. Monetary policy decisions, right? Poor data means that the Fed is more likely to let recessions or inflation get out of hand before they can react, or even and also more likely to overreact to information because there are bigger standard errors, that their windshield is cloudier, right? Mm-hmm. They're not seeing as clearly what's going on, and this could make job losses or inflation worse. Right? More recessions, deeper recessions, more inflation. You know, more spells of inflation. Inflation adjustments to long-term contracts. Well, without long-term contracts, without good data, then you have companies, workers less likely, less comfortable with signing long-term contracts, and that means you're renegotiating more frequently. And when you negotiate, you have more contention because you're not working from common data. I mean, the BLS was created during a time when companies and nascent unions were killing each other in the street. And the whole purpose of the BLS was to give them a common set of information to work from, to negotiate from. Unemployment insurance extensions. Without good data on where unemployment is high, it's very hard to target those groups, those communities that need it. Financial markets. With worse data, the financial markets will be more volatile, they'll be riskier, and they'll misallocate investments. Instead of going where the need is greatest, where the return is highest, it'll go someplace else, right? So the whole company, the whole country just works as less efficiently.
I got it. I've got a question that comes from Matt, graduated in 91, who asks, in the current age of big data, how are surveys still relevant? Isn't the data out there in payroll companies and other sources perhaps more reliable? They seem more reliable than asking the person on the street with a series of survey questions. Do you know what Matt's getting at here?
Absolutely. And Matt is right that there's this explosion of other great data out there. And I think we'll be talking more about that as we go further. But we can't give up on surveys completely because there's some information that your employer doesn't know about you, right? Mm-hmm. First of all, your employer doesn't know anything about you if you don't have a job with them, right? So unemployed people, we need to know how many of them are looking for work, why they're looking for work or not looking for work, what their characteristics are, right? And you're just not going to get that from administrative data. You have to ask people what's going on in their lives. Right. So, and the same way with a lot of health data, with people's plans for the future. All right. Those things require asking people questions. So surveys are not going to go away. They should not go away, but they need to be limited to situations where it's the only way to get that information. And so they will be as important as ever, which is why we need to protect them and improve them. And then we need to tap into these huge other resources to improve the information that we have at our fingertips.
So going back to the question before we brought Matt's in, talking about the ripple effects on the workforce economy, right? Big picture kind of stuff. How do you recommend that we address or overcome these challenges? Everybody's got a different role to play here, but what is your prescription?
It's really two parts. First of all, we need to reduce to the bare minimum, right, the response burden that we have on people who are being asked to participate in surveys. Right. And that's a lot through safe electronic data collection. So people needs to be efficient and people need to trust that it's safe. Right. And then we need to create these new data products that I've been talking about, using the explosion of non-survey data and tapping into that data that's more timely, more accurate, and more granular than we've had before.
And then when you describe non-survey data, are you talking about the payroll companies' data that comes from employers, et cetera? Are there other sources or other data nodes?
Oh, yeah. So definitely data from employers, and I'll talk about that more going forward. But also it's from employers, but job posting information, right? And then there's a lot of transactional data. So beyond the realm of the BLS, there's a lot of transactional data that goes into like the Census Bureau's measures of economic activity. All right. And BLS has been and will continue to tap into more and more electronic price data to improve inflation measures. Right? So the more we can move away from going to stores and looking at prices listed in stores and tap into electronic versions, then it's more efficient and often, and sometimes better data than otherwise. So, and then there's crowdsourcing data, internet data, and a wealth of scientific data that's useful too, like weather data and information from hospitals and health data, things like that.
Oh, sure. Good. I'm glad I asked. All right, let's go back to you and your successor at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, William Beach, operating as a tandem in many ways, certainly in the media over the last week. You and William Beach run an organization called the Friends of the BLS. Last week, Bloomberg reports that you and Beach strongly urged Congress to take some action here. What are you urging Congress to take action on specifically?
Well, in some ways, the Bureau of Labor Statistics current population survey is a prime example of the challenges facing the statistical system in BLS. So the CPS, the current population survey, is the source of the unemployment rate that comes out the first Friday of every month. And we talked about before, there's really no public or private substitute for this particular information that gives us the unemployment rate. But the response rate, as I've shown you, the response rate is falling at the same time that our real funds and the BLS's real funds have been falling. So the BLS has announced that it has to reduce the sample size of the current population survey. So right now, BLS asks 60,000 households every month what's going on in their house. And it's going to be, it looked like it was going to decline to around 55,000 instead of 60,000. A smaller sample means less detail for local areas, for veterans, for teenagers, for occupations, et cetera. Anytime you break up into different groups, that's what's going to be disappearing as a result of this. And there'll be more error in all of the estimates as a result of this. Now, BLS has a plan for collecting the data electronically going forward, and it could implement this within 3 years. But BLS has been asking for this for 5 years, and it hasn't been funded despite repeated requests. So that's what we're raising the flag about, that the CPS is going to have this degradation in its quality, and it's only going to get worse without more funding.
So let me ask you, thinking long game here, thinking about an historical view of how this fits into the history of the Department of Labor and the BLS. Have these historically been like high functioning agencies, government agencies? I ask because you're suggesting that they're subject to political turmoil or lack of political will, things along those lines. Have these historically been high functioning government agencies?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the BLS has been called the jewel in the crown of the Department of Labor for a long time, right? It has an excellent reputation with data users and in Washington. And when I traveled around as BLS commissioner, the comments that I heard most were how useful the data are, how helpful the staff is, and how the data users just wanted more and more and more from the BLS. So it has a really high reputation among the people who use the data most and those who rely on it. The BLS has no enemies on the Hill that I know of, but it lacks a champion. And that's a problem in these days. It's almost as bad to not have a champion as to have enemies. There aren't any powerful senators or members who stood up to prevent these real cuts in BLS funding and to support modernization. And that's why we're in the situation that we're in. And in addition, more and more you have politicians and other commentators who occasionally react to data releases with conspiracy theories about tampering, interference of various kinds. These groundless accusations are harmful because they undermine trust in the BLS. And trust, you might not think about it, but this is actually something that I really came to appreciate when I was at the BLS, that trust is mission critical for a statistical agency. Simply said, people won't use the data if they don't trust it, right? And if they don't use it, then why should we be producing it, right? If they don't trust that the statistics are accurate and objective, the game is lost. And data providers and data subjects have to trust that their data is being used for important and for accurate statistics. And if they don't trust, then they're not going to participate in the surveys, which will drive down the quality of the surveys, right? And what they need to be able to trust is the data aren't going to be used for these non-statistical purposes, which actually has, it's not a squishy concept, it's a clear one. A non-statistical purpose is enforcement purposes, political campaigning, company marketing, right? The data that you give to a statistical agency, your private data cannot be used for those purposes. Right? And if people don't trust that the data is going to be private, confidential, then they won't participate in the surveys. So while BLS doesn't, this is not because BLS is being targeted by people who know that there are problems. It is being left high and dry when it needs help.
Yeah, thank you for that. And this was an issue that viewer Chris flagged, who happens to work at a U.S. statistical agency, talking about the distrust and that particular social crisis that we have going around there. I want to off ramp a little bit. Angela MJ checks in and says, "I work in healthcare, and there's been a huge push to collect more race and ethnicity data. Currently, CMS, forgive me, I don't know what CMS is. Maybe you can sort us out. And state databases have been our main source for this type of data. Do you have any suggestions or alternate data sources in order to collect race and ethnicity data?" Erica.
Yeah, so the CMS is the Center for Medicare, Medicaid Services. So it's a data repository for all of this. Okay. So race and ethnicity data. There's the need for this is really to answer questions of equity and in service and reach, for so many of our programs. It's hard to know whether or not you are actually whether programs are well targeted and how big the needs are if you don't have measures by different communities of what's going on, right? And it's more challenging these days because we've really broadened our concept of race and ethnicity. And we have more intermarriage amongst racial and ethnic groups. We recognize that identification can't be done in the simple ways, which were probably never great, of having the person at the counter, at the DMV counter, assign the race of the person who's applying for a license. And so there's a lot of research being sponsored by the statistical agencies and being done by academics on what the right way is to collect that information and how to update it. So this is an active area. There's guidance that was just issued by the Committee on National Statistics, and also a directive from the Office of Management and Budget, Office of the Chief Statistician of the U.S. to begin to address these. So this is a challenging area. It's a good thing that we're making progress, but the work is not done.
Debbie, 88 PhD 96 asks, what efforts have been done for all the data nerds across departments to work toward modernization of the data collection? Hopefully I haven't stolen your thunder for a forthcoming question, but talk about modernization a little bit.
Yeah, so the modernization, um, the the two things that have been done, and a lot of, I mean, this has been going on, right? I think BLS in its company surveys now, and many of them now have as many as 5 different modes, right? So the easiest mode for a dentist's office is not the same easy mode for Amazon or something like that, right? For a large company. So adding modes that that make it easy for the smallest and the largest companies to respond is really important. And the agencies have been doing that. And that, if you actually go back to the response rates, you'll see that there wasn't that much of a decline in BLS. Let's see, let me go back. Yeah, that's what I need to do. Yeah, there wasn't that much of a decline in the response rates for the establishment surveys for a long time, because that was a period of time where BLS was adding more and more response options. But now those that's kind of been flattened out. Rather, that we've gained everything that we could from there. And now it's time to focus on some other things. All right. So one route to reducing response burden is actually to try and find these other sources, so you don't have to ask the companies that information anymore, right? So try and collect data from surveys, from government administrative data, from aggregators, from crowdsourcing, the sources that we talked before. Then the other, when you're talking about households, you can minimize response burden usually by collecting the data over the internet. Most people prefer that. Not everyone, but most people prefer that, find that much easier than a phone survey or someone in person or a paper survey. So that's important. Going back now to the companies, there's another thing that we can do, which is to standardize data to reduce reporting burden, and that's a really important issue, opportunity that's been presented. So one way, actually, let me show you what we can do here. Let me go to
Oh yeah, I like this.
Yeah. So here's an example of why the response burden is so high for employers, right? So now let's focus on employer data. This is the information that employers collect on their workers. How many hours? What did they work? How much were they paid? What jobs do they do, etc. So right now, you can think about the system that we have as having 3 major groups of organizations. You've got the employers who are employing people, right? Then you have a group of collectors, and we're focusing now on the government, right? So what kind of government agencies are collecting information from employers about their workers? Well, here's a list. We've got SDC, EOC, unemployment insurance, new hires. That's a social security program. BLS, Census, IRS, some more social security programs, other federal programs, and other state programs. So each of these is pinging employers individually to collect information and collecting a different set of information from each of these employers. So if you're a very large employer, you could be responding to 175 of these different agencies, each asking for some different combination of information. So then these agencies collect it all, and then they send it to users for operations, for analytics, statistics, right? And so you've got this spaghetti mess, and this is the current situation, all right? And you can see why employers complain about burden. There is an alternative. There's a 21st century alternative to this, which would say, let's agree on standards for employer information that each of these agencies agree is what they need, all right? And then let's have some kind of mechanism for the employers to send the same set of information, each of them, to some kind of central clearinghouse or mechanism. So this is from the Jobs and Employment Data Exchange, JEDX, which is an effort being launched by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. And they said, look, if we can agree on what it is employers should be collecting, then we can have a system that creates some kind of a clearinghouse and then sends the information needed to all the users in a safe way. And you get rid of this entire spaghetti mess, right? That would be very beneficial to employers. And there's been a survey of HR professionals at large firms that have said that there are two reasons why this really appeals to them. One is lower burden, and the other is more guarantee of the safety of the information.
Yeah, well, we'll stay tuned and see what happens with the Jobs and Employment Data Exchange in the near term. Seems like streamlining would fit the bill quite nicely. So beyond this particular initiative, do you see any other opportunities that we can capitalize on? Any other wins or ideas for how we can improve in the near term?
Yeah, the main one is that when we have access to other kinds of information like this, in addition to surveys, then we can start doing more and more combining of data from different sources. So merging, matching, modeling to get us some of the granularity and the frequency and the timeliness that we want. So we can envision whole new products that say, work from weekly payroll numbers to give us a weekly number of what's going on, and then feed into monthly numbers that are more broader, more information, and then go to annual numbers that provide even more depth of what's going on, right? And so we can have this continuum of information that that addresses the need for more granularity as well as the need for more accuracy and more timeliness. All of these things is going to take a lot of ingenuity and a lot of research, but it's all possible. And I think the statistical agencies are like chomping at the bit to try.
You know, I want to chime in, Chris. I should have taken this question a few minutes ago, but it still works, and I think it's actually a really important question. Chris asks, does the Bureau of Labor Statistics use field data collection or incentive payments to help boost response rates? How does that work? Is that kosher? Is that legitimate? Is the data, efficacious? What do you think of that?
There's been a lot of research on paying people to provide answers. And it's mixed, right? It seems to not surprisingly be most helpful for lower income groups, right? And it doesn't, when you're talking about a survey that is going to a very broad swath, on average, it doesn't increase response rates very much. But for some groups and in some situations, it can. So most statistical agencies don't use it, but some have for particular kinds of surveys.
Sure, great. Thank you, Chris, for that question. There's a report that you asked me to share with viewers. It's called the American Statistical Association. They published a report called "The Nation's Data at Risk: Meeting America's Information Needs for the 20th Century." We're going to provide a link for our viewers to download the full report or the highlights, which might be a great intro. What is the takeaway from this report? Who's the audience? Who benefits from checking out this report?
Well, I think ultimately all of the nations, all the data users, right? So this is in some ways similar to what the National Society of Engineers does when it evaluates the conditions of our roads and bridges every few years, right? And this is the first edition of an attempt to do the same thing. And it's the idea is the same thing. Infrastructure, this is information infrastructure, just like physical infrastructure. We use it all the time, and we need to know how good it is and where we're headed. So, the audience is, frankly, appropriators, right? And also data users to say, okay, what's the situation? How well are we doing compared to, how well we might have thought we were doing, right? Because, the monthly employment situation comes out every month, and people may not know that there are problems, growing problems behind it, right? So they document, this is really interesting study. They document the headwinds that the statistical agencies face: falling response rates, costly to maintain response rates, and increasing threats to privacy and confidentiality that we've talked about. This in response, they say that we need to also to strengthen the stat agencies, right? In weaknesses that they document. These weaknesses are three critical supports that the agencies need at this time. First of all, they need adequate funding, right? They need legislative protection for their professional autonomy. We can talk about a little bit more about that. But one of the things that's been found is that while BLS has a lot of protection, most of the agencies have a lot of protection for the autonomy, it's more embedded in norms than it is in law. And that means that it's at risk from changing norms. All right. In particular, if you weakened civil service protections for the civil servants, the data nerds we're talking about, right? They also need more support from their parent agencies that they often get, because the budget requests go through the parent agencies. And if the parent agencies aren't supporting the budget requests, then they can be in trouble. And they need these resources for innovation are really important. Another thing that they highlight is we have a decentralized statistical system in the US. We don't have a Stats USA like there's a Stats Canada or the National Statistical Agency in the UK, right? Instead, we have 13 major statistical agencies and over 100 other federal agencies that produce national statistics. And in order for this decentralized system to function properly, we need a much stronger chief statistician's office. Right now, the chief statistician's office in OMB has about 5 employees, and it's supposed to be coordinating the work of all of these agencies. So it really doesn't have adequate resources to perform its job, and especially coordinating amongst these agencies.
So given that, do you have any further recommendations for policymakers and lawmakers? What would you urge them to do, similar to what we pointed to earlier, urges Congress to take action? What would you say to policymakers and lawmakers, legislators?
Well, I have kind of a list here.
I'm sure you do.
Right? But I would start off with, don't make or repeat groundless attacks on the integrity of the statistical agencies and on the data. If you are not happy with a release, find out more about it. Suggestions for improvements are always welcome, but the groundless attack that, oh, someone must be fudging the data is counterproductive. Secondly, I would say that it's really important for policymakers, lawmakers to think of statistical agencies as data infrastructure, that in the information age, we need more than ever, right? We need our data to be interoperable. We need our data to be reliable, good, and we really can't promote the efficient exchange of goods, services, ideas, policies without this infrastructure provided by the statistical system. All of the tech companies that are producing their own data products have at their core national statistics that they are using. Another thing that I would really recommend is that they fight off any effort to use Schedule F designations for senior civil servants. Now, this is jargon within the Beltway stuff, but it's huge, right? There is there was a directive put out in the last years of the Trump administration that would convert most of the senior staff in federal agencies to political appointees who serve at the pleasure of the president. Now, this opens the door for all sorts of interference, so that fears of interference and politicization, then they would be well grounded. Right? So what kind of interference would be possible? Well, you could have the release narratives. So the narratives that surround an economic release, the paragraphs that describe the data, right? All of a sudden, those could be politicized, right? Right now at BLS, there are only a certain set of adjectives that they use, and only in certain circumstances, right? They used to say, we try to make our releases as boring as possible. We describe what went up and what went down, and that's it. The spin is done by the policy folks, right? Now suppose that the release itself had this spin in it, all right? They could speed up or withhold releases at will, or cut out sections of them that they didn't like, right? And just deprive people of information that they didn't want to release. They could give special, early, or more granular access for financial enforcement or political purposes, for these non-statistical purposes that we talked about, right? Right now, that doesn't happen, but it could, right? They could impose unfounded methodologies that got answers they wanted. They could appoint unqualified or incompetent employees, right? You would be ruining the career path within the statistical agencies, so you would be less attractive for people to join them, and that would also be a problem. So this would be a big change for the BLS, which has just one presidential appointee, the commissioner, who serves for a 4-year fixed term, which means they almost always overlap different presidents' administrations. All right. And where everybody else is a career data nerd. Right. Now, the other things that I would say that policymakers should do potentially, in addition to not doing the Schedule F thing, right, would be to strengthen coordination among the agencies, right, for data sharing, for consolidation of data collection, for IT, training, etc., so that you get more economies of scope and scale as you're doing more of these innovative data exercises. Getting everybody involved is useful. I also think they should promote the data standards that I was talking about. We need them for employer data, but we also need them for medical data. Right now, this is one of the problems with the electronic medical records, is they're not standardized enough, right? Okay. And then they need to, I think, focus a little bit more on removing some of the barriers, the legal barriers, the regulatory barriers, the cost barriers that often stand in the way of tapping into new data sources and to sharing data sources across agencies. So BLS and Census have two different data series on employment by industry, and they don't agree. That's a problem for anybody who tries to use both sets of data. So this BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, is integrating information from BLS and Census all the time, and they have to have workarounds because these two sets of data don't agree, and they should agree. Right? So I recommend for the policymakers.
Lots of opportunities, lots of challenges there. What would you recommend that we do as citizens? What can we do?
There's actually more to do than you might think. Citizens need to understand that they have a voice and they should use it, right? So use your voice. Don't take these data for granted, because if you do, they may disappear. First of all, you need to do everything you can to maintain the trust in the statistical agencies. That means not just rolling your eyes, but actively debunking conspiracy theories and other unfounded attacks. Don't let them just pass you by. Crazy Uncle Milt is going on and on again, right? So, ask the questions. Well, what makes you think that? How would that work? Do you know that this is, do you know how these data are actually put together, right? So debunk those conspiracy theories. Very simple thing. Cite your sources when you use BLS and other federal data. People need to know how foundational it is, and too often, even academics will put the data up and not cite the source, and that's important. Ensure that you, your family members, your community members, your employers participate in federal surveys. When people talk about them, encourage them to participate, tell them how important it is, thank them for their service. And I particularly want to encourage people to ask their employers if they participate in surveys, because a lot of employers don't. And they should, right? So I remember reaching out to some large educational institutions, shall remain nameless, pointing out that they were not participating in these surveys. And it wasn't until the professors in those universities spoke up that the administration and those universities started participating in surveys again. Right. But this is true of financial firms. They have a low response rates, along with educational institutions and many other companies. So tell them why they should participate and encourage them to do that. And then your employer, your professional association, your advocacy group, your local officials all lobby. And mostly they lobby about cutting taxes or regulatory issues. They should be lobbying for the statistics that they use and you use in your work. And so you, as a trusted voice, an influential voice in your organizations, make sure that your organizations are on record for supporting the statistical agencies. They can write letters, get them to write letters, get them to sign on letters, and to get them to do the things that I've mentioned: the funding, protecting autonomy, strengthening coordination, removing barriers. And if you want to find out about these issues, join the Friends of BLS so you know what to tell them to do. So your voice then would be helping fill this void that I've talked about between what the elected officials are pushing for and what needs to be done. So you need to influence those elected officials to know that this is important. you can provide the vision that they need to influence them to protect this part of our infrastructure. So we can avoid a future of lousy data causing lousy decisions. And that's when everybody puts their weight into the effort to, go in search of a vibrant future that's founded on modern data and good decisions that result from it.
Erica Groshen, I want to thank you for the critical work that you do and for the generous use of your time and spending with us here at Cornell Keynotes. Thank you so much for joining us from Seattle today.
Well, thank you, Christopher, and all of the audience for taking the time to join me on this journey into the interesting world.
We've got some work to do. Viewers, thanks for joining us today. Remember, this is live. The recording will be available in just a moment. And please, if you would, stick around and let us know how we did. Let's throw up that QR code and get some survey data from our audience on how we performed today. Thanks, everyone, for joining Cornell Keynotes. We'll see you next time. Thank you.